Shrajana?
Hi, Akhila. Yeah, I think a minute. Should we begin or should we wait for someone?
So I think yes, right? We began on time the last time as well. So do the same.
All right. Hi all. Welcome to the second edition of our division seminar. And it's my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. SWARNAMALYA Ganesh, who will be speaking to us. And the topic of her talk, just a minute, the topic of her talk is titled Why We Should Not Write a Book on the Devadasi, Subaltern Heritages, Post-Colonial Redefinitions and Appropriations. And I'd like to mention that this is part of her ongoing series of interventions in practice, pedagogy, through research and dissemination that she's titling under the overarching theme of Decolonizing Dance History. Thank you, Dr. SWARNAMALYA Ganesh. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Shrajana, for mooting this idea and for introducing me. And it's always a pleasure to speak to our friends at Kriya. Thank you very much, everybody. I'm not going to waste much time, and I'll jump right into the paper. It's a written paper, and there are illustrations in between. So as and when it's required, I'll share screen. Sadir is the name of Bharatanatyam, associated with its performers called Devadasis. So for those of you who do not know the term Sadir, it is actually the Bharatanatyam that you worldwide popularly is known. And it is associated, the term Sadir is associated with Devadasis. Much like the rest of the agrarian society, they too, that is the Devadasis, were too part of a system of land, occupation and caste-based segmentary formations. They were placed in the middling caste order in early modern society. The unique element, though, that was with the Devadasi community was that members, particularly women, were also brought into its fold by way of religious and social sanctions, such as practices of dedication, adoption, etc. Therefore, the community composition often varied in different geographies, even within Tamil regions. From the Kaikolars to Mudaliyars and Vellalar caste, they ranged within the various middling caste orders of the day. Without going into the details of the social structures of the Devadasi community, one can say that heritage, or that which the women inherited in this community, was based on initiation as an artist and not merely birth. On the subject of what each generation of performing Devadasis inherited, whether born into the community or dedicated, we must take into account everything from legacy, rites of passage, economic assets, and social position. But let me move directly to the problem of inheritance, which is more relevant for our purpose today. In the 20th century, public discourse raged on about the morality of the Devadasi. Because the Devadasi woman or the Devadasi women were the only performing women caste community back then, the act of their dedication to temples as a religious sanction came under scrutiny, instilling the idea that if the dedication was banned, somehow they will be rehabilitated automatically. Upon first glance, this idea and its basis seems suspiciously Orientalist. It was largely a dilemma of the Indian elite, though. The rise of nationalism and the immediate hunt for the glorious Indian heritage added pressures to how reformations were looked at. Independent India was preoccupied with incorporating science, history, and progress, and it did so often by criticizing Indian native inheritances. The dwindling economy left many migrant women artists of the Devadasi community quite vulnerable to exploitation, and this was argued as her promiscuity. The reformers of the Devadasi movement were indeed products of an age which was very self-confident of its potential to be pure in its culture, and that could impress the West by reinstating a glorious past. This moment of annihilation defined, limited, and distorted contact between various cultures within the South Indian society that had previous histories. The mounting oppressor-victim binary discourse, unfortunately, did not account for patterns of admiration and collaborative positions adopted within these cultures. After all, equality and inequality are not to be the sole determinants of cultural encounters, as Dorothy Figueroa notes. I stand before you today at the cusp of my own identity as an upper caste woman who believes in the lived experience of caste oppression of many disadvantaged communities and people, particularly that of the Devadasi women. Therefore, not for a moment am I making an argument here that there was no inequality, exploitation, or marginalization of the Devadasi woman by dominant cultures and practices of inherent discrimination. The point I'm trying to make here is that even as the woman artist was marginalized, her art or her heritage was sought after. Her inheritance has been made the site of conflict, locating appropriation squarely in the binary where structural power of the upper castes had alone determined both the personal and the political. Without taking away from that discourse, I want to examine us, the contemporary post-colonial scholar and artist, as well as audience, who conveniently situate all narratives about the Devadasi only in historic oppression, while sidelining the fact that the exploitation of the illiterate Devadasi, which the elite social reformers of the 20th century set out to obliterate, seem in fact a continuous presence in our lives even today. As a student from age 3 under various Devadasi women, I see an insider-outsider perspective to this conflict. By virtue of having a lifelong Guru-Sishya relationship with many of these women, I have been freed from the urgency to narrate their story. Because as a learner, her life and art are not stories to be told. That does not mean I receive without context or am I complacent to the social imbalances skewed certainly towards my side between us. The prism I see is that of her art. After all, the Devadasi is by definition an artist. I associate the moment of conflict to the idea that Althusser derived. All of history is contingent, an encounter. Please watch this short video clip I'm going to share with you, which is from a 1940s film. And the moment is this. This is the peak of the Devadasi discourse in the public domain. India was sending troops to fight with the Allies in the World War II. The elite Mudaliar community girls were sent to school to study, and in school they were suddenly taught Sadir. The society at large was astonished by this. They were also taken aback, but also curiously proud of how their girls were newly acquiring talents and this art form. Dance was taught by the hereditary male dance masters. All of this encapsulated in this very short video clip from a film, one second, called, yes. Sabhapati. Is my screen visible?
Yeah, it's visible.
Yes, Professor.
பள்ளிக்கூடத்துல கூட இப்ப பரதநாட்டியம் கத்துக்கணுமா? ஆமா ஆமா, அது ஏன் கேக்குறீங்க? அதுல நம்ம குழந்தை ரொம்ப கெட்டிக்காரின்னு மெடல் எல்லாம் வாங்கியிருக்கா. இப்ப வாய்ப்புன்றாங்களே, அதுக்கு கலெக்டர் பங்களால ஒரு ஆட்டம், அதுல இவ நாட்டியம், அதுக்காக பழகுறா. ஓஹோ.
At the forefront of the search for her heritage were the Brahmins. Here, one must also be informed of the Brahmin community's historical connections with the arts as poets, composers, and patrons for over 4 centuries in South India before this time. Take the case of Kshetraya, take the case of Govindaraja Dikshitar, take the case of Muthuswami Dikshitar, Tyagayar, so on and so forth, and many other patrons as well. The disenfranchisement of the Devadasi woman's social position coincided with the rise of the middle-class Brahmin woman's emancipation. The need to protect the Devadasi's health under constitutional consciousness collided with the dismantling of traditional patronage systems like the temples. Overall, the colonial experience made a paradigm shift in all spheres of life, such as nationalism, industrialization, Dravidianism, caste-based politics, globalization, only to name a few. I identified this social moment when too much was happening in the Indian society as the moment when the art of the Devadasi, her heritage, was redistributed. This is the history of encounters. I'm not suggesting in any way a series of happy coincidences or an apology for the marginalization of the Devadasi at the hands of patriarchy or caste. But this is in fact to redefine the narrative that has oversimplified the situations in which the Devadasi's life was torn apart. Despite battling poverty and stigma, as in all stories of resilience from the margins, the lives of women whom I have learned under upholds their pride as artists rather than as tales of distress and defeat. If one chooses to read between the lines and cull from these lives a universal theory that they wish to tell the world, that is naturally the point where we have to look for appropriation. So how can the common reader of the history of Devadasi art form understand appropriation? Sadir is the Devadasi heritage that was taught and learned. Around 1930s, the teachers of this heritage became the men of the community as opposed to the women. These men decided to participate in transferring this heritage to non-hereditary women. Did this obliterate the voices of their own women? Yes. But even in this moment of appropriation was a bid for their own survival. However, the marginalization of the women of their community by the men comes in the form of a rhetoric. I'm going to share with you a letter that was written to me by one of the Isavelalar Sangams. I had interacted with all the Isavelalar Sangams of Tamil Nadu, and the narrative was pretty much the same. Here is a letter in Tamil that really encapsulates the rhetoric of how they were once glorious. Their women were once glorious. They were part of the temple and the great Indian heritage. And then they had fallen. And it was, of course, Karunanidhi and the entire move to put them under the Isavelalar umbrella that has emancipated them. Whether learning from male gurus or, as in my case, learning directly from the women gurus, one thing is of prime importance. The moment of transfer of heritage is one built on trust. Unlike in an ethnographic research, where rapport is trust-building mechanism that primarily serves the interests of the researcher, the Guru-Sishya mode gives far more agency to the person who is the transferer, the guru. Due to this reversed power structure, the learning becomes a serious long-term engagement that allows the student to sensitively understand the complexities of the Devadasi's existence at the crossroads of historic and continued encounters. The current imaginations of the Devadasi problem totalizes her as a homogenized entity whose experience of marginalization is assumed as something even. These constructions are far from reality, built often on the interpreting agent's knowledge gathering that is more from their own colonial experience, such as secularism, caste, freedom, etc. Let me illustrate this point with some examples. Dance scholars identify 1947 as a seminal moment when the Devadasi Dedication Act was passed in Tamil Nadu, criminalizing the practice. But my guru, R. Muthukannamallamma, does not recognize 1947 as that moment when her social status and livelihood were irrevocably altered. She, in fact, was dancing up until 1970s, both in the temple of Viralimalai and the Samasthanam of Pudukkottai. What happened in 1971? The Privy Purse Abolition Act directly affected her economic inheritance and patronage from the Samasthanams. Hence, she sees Indira Gandhi's role in her moment of disintegration as more significant than that of, say, Muthulakshmi Reddy, who brought the Devadasi Abolition Act.
அதே மப்பா ராமச்சந்திரன் சொன்னாருக்கு 18 ஏக்கர் காடு 2 ஏக்கர் வய இந்த அட்டைகளுக்கு வந்து இந்த அட்டை லாவணம் வேற இல்லை. எனக்கு நான் வர பார்த்தா எனக்கு லாவணம் லாவணம் பேரு எங்க அப்பாவுக்கு முடியலைன்னு எங்க அப்பா பேருக்கு மாத்திருக்காங்க. எங்க அப்பா வந்து எங்க பேருக்கு மாத்துவாரு. அப்புறமே எங்க அப்பா போற காலத்துல வந்துட்டாரு பணத்தை தீர்வு அடிக்க நேரத்தை எடுத்துக்கிட்டாங்க. அந்த லாவணம் அந்த அத்தனை பொம்பளைகளுக்கு பணமே வாங்கல மகாராஜ காலத்துல கடமை ஆயிடுச்சு. இவன் நிலம் சும்மாவே பட்டா ஆம்பளை வந்து இதுக்குதான் காசு. அதுல எங்க ஐயாவுக்கெல்லாம் 14,000 போட்டுச்சு. 14,000 போட்டு அவர் இந்த காடெல்லாம் விற்று இது வந்து அந்த நிலத்தெல்லாம் மறுபடியும் எடுத்துக்க வச்சேன். மீண்டும் எடுத்துக்கிட்டாங்க இல்லையா அப்ப.
Another example, as I earlier mentioned, the Devadasi community comprised of women from various castes. Firmly entrenched in the Varna system, because of their artistic position, the community enjoyed a fairly high social status, even as a middling caste all the way. In the 1950s, it was the Dravidian leader M. Karunanidhi, the then CM of Tamil Nadu, who himself belonged to the Periyamelam of the hereditary community, the Nadaswaram players community, who realigned the entire community as Isai Vellalar and to the BC category. His intention was to bring them under the bracket of affirmative state policies. In recent times, an attempt is made by post-colonial academics and other politically motivated groups to argue that the term Devadasi is inaccurate in representing her. The reason they cite is that the Devadasi's non-temple and secular identity is mired in the term Deva, God, and Dasi, servitude. They further suggest that she is better identified under the name hereditary courtesan from the Isai Vellalar caste. I'll let us listen to what Muthukannamal has to say for this. Just a moment.
எந்த ஜாதி முதல் ஆடினாங்க?
மோனார் விடுதேன், முதலியார் விடுதேன். முதலியார் விடுதேன் இந்த சதுர ஆடினது. என்ன எல்லாருக்கும் கோயிலில் பொட்டு கட்டி சேருவோம்ல மகாராஜா காலத்தில். நிலமெல்லாம் விட்டு காடு வயல் எல்லாம் விட்டு சாதஞ்சம்பளம் கொடுத்து அதனால வந்து கோயிலில் சேருவோம். கோயிலில் சேர்த்து 32 பேர், ராணிமலையில 32 பேர், மைத்தூர்ல 2 பேர் ஒருத்தங்க. இந்த மாதிரி ஒரு ஃபேமஸும் இல்லை. இங்கே தான் எல்லா விசேஷமும் நல்லா நடக்கும். ஆமா, அதனால நாங்களே முதல் சதுராங்க முதலியார் மோலார விடணும்னு சொல்லுவாங்க. முதலியார் விடணும்னு சொல்லுவாங்க. இப்ப கலைஞர் வந்ததுக்கு அப்புறம் தான் இசை வேளாளர் அவர் தான் மாத்தினது. தேவதாசிங்கிறது கோயில்ல போய் பொட்டு கட்டுறதுனால தேவதாசி. அந்த சாமிக்கு வந்து சுப்பிரமணிய சாமிக்கு போய் கோயில்ல போய் நாங்க எல்லாம் பண்ணி கல்யாணம் மாதிரி பொட்டு கட்டுற விசேஷம். அன்னைக்கு பொட்டு கட்டிட்டு வந்துருவோம். வீட்டுல வந்து வடவாயத்தோட சாப்பாடு போக்குவரத்தெல்லாம் நல்லா போகும். கல்யாணம் எப்படி பண்றோம் அது மாதிரி பொட்டு கட்டுறது.
இந்த பேர் வந்து அவமான பேரா?
இந்த வந்து அவமான பேரு கிடையாது. தேவதாசிங்கிறது எவ்வளவு கௌரவமான பேரு. ஆடப்பாட இருந்து ரொம்ப மரியாதையா இருந்து எல்லாம். தேவதாசிங்கிறது இதே கெட்ட பேரே கிடையாது, கெடுதலே கிடையாது.
இன்னைக்கு வந்து உங்களுடைய நீங்க இருக்கும் பொழுது இப்ப நான் உங்களை குரு முத்துக்கண்ணம்மாள் அம்மா தேவதாசி பரம்பரையை சேர்ந்தவர்கள் அப்படின்னு போட்டா அதுல வந்து உங்களுக்கு பெருமையா இல்ல உங்களுக்கு அவமானம்?
எனக்கு போட்டா பெருமை. இப்ப வந்து என்னை வந்து நீங்க கூட்டிட்டு போய் தேவதாசி முத்துக்கண்ணம்மாள் அப்படின்னு விராலிமலை அப்படின்னு போட்டால் எனக்கு கௌரவம் தான்.
Not only does she clearly articulate that Isaivallalar is a political umbrella identity given to her, but she differentiates between herself and other women who belong to different castes, such as Sengunda Mudali, Mudaliyar herself from the Mudaliyar caste, Agamudayar, Melakarar, etc. She importantly reaffirms her identity as a Devadasi. Therefore, the suggestions that Devadasi as a term must be expunged in favor of an English term courtesan, which is merely not even a rough translation actually, is a negation of the subaltern's voice. In their deeply held connections to the temple, the Devadasi locates her very heritage. Many among them call the repertoires, their own repertoires, including Muthukannamalama, Koil and Kottagai Sadir, temple and social Sadir. These are delightfully multilingual, reflective of the community's historic encounters with many cultures. But she frames her identity within the scope of her religious sanction. If that is how she wishes it, it is troubling when the epistemic world drowns her voice and her point of view. Now let's move to the next part of the problem of appropriation. The question of who is listening to her voice, how, where, when, and how is it transmitted? If one wants to understand the Devadasi's position, we must consider her artistic practice as the prime material through which she establishes her agentic thrust, social expressions, and uses it as a co-constructive mechanism. Let me use the example of teaching, since we are still speaking about the Guru-Sishya paradigm. Even when the men were teaching the non-hereditary women, they stuck to traditional methods of transfer that involved oral learnings, memorizing, native language use, and native social contextualizations. For example, my guru and I spoke exclusively only in Tamil. Sarasama started, my other guru, KJ Sarasama, started to teach me dances whose literary content were very erotic, as early as age 12 or 13. I was made to sing and dance these compositions, but none of the meanings of these songs that we sang were explicitly discussed. It was only through music, gestures, and mimetic articulations that I was taught. Today, huge debates rage on about the appropriateness of teaching young children such pieces, seeking censorship, which actually cuts through the method of inheritance, thereby re-stigmatizing the Devadasi as promiscuous. However, the reality is that it takes many years of diligent practice of these intricate compositions, by which time the learner will have no cultural shock, instead absolute awe for the art of subtlety in the Devadasi's portrayal. Even the Oriental gaze was cleverly subsumed in many ways by this other artist to make it part of her routine. Dances of snake charmers, peacock dances, kings and darbar pageantry, English language songs to entertain company officials, the violin, clarinet, and concerts all became part of this other repertoire. Thus, the subaltern comfortably domesticated the Western gaze and conversed with it on its own terms. These intra-actions of the art with the life of the artist cannot be observed in an ethnographic exercise. Therefore, a non-dancer who is a researcher, who speaks for the Devadasi, is twice removed from her. Once by the lack of material or the natural language of dance, and once again by adopting the lens of the Western language, English, in order to see her. The third difficulty in hearing the subaltern today is that she is always framed in the English language as the subject that is unfinished in its democratizing. This illusionary subjectivity homogenizes her and isolates her as a project that needs our assistance. In a recent book titled Unfinished Gestures, the author speaks of the Devadasi using the subaltern conceptual framework. What we see are ideologies that advocate the Devadasi's position against hegemonic structural powers. But what is cloaked is the author's need to prove that he is political and modern, both determinants of post-colonial frames. In his claim to neutralize power, the author recolonizes the Devadasi and traps her in his ideological conceptions, which she may not have subscribed to necessarily. A non-performer, he established an ethnographic informant relationship with my guru R. Muthukannamalama, the author of Unfinished Gestures in this case. I'm just taking one example here. He established an ethnographer informant relationship with my guru Muthukannamalama a decade ago. These interactions spanned over 4 brief summers during his field trips to India from the US, accompanied by his dancer friend. They approached Muthukannamalama to learn a few Sadir pieces. The author himself was only an observer during these sessions. Deeply limited by his access to her native language, both dance as well as Tamil, he discovered her entirely in translation. While she has no recollection of him or his direct interactions with her, he embarked to view her through the social ideological lenses he has acquired. In the book, he tells the story of my guru and that of few other Devadasi women from the Kalavantula tradition of Andhra. None of these women have met each other. They do not share geographic, social, artistic contexts. In meshing them together under the net of his political and modern frames, at once all their voices have been muted. They are pointed to as over their subjects throughout the book, to whom only Soneji, an observer ethnographer, has access. Invisibilizing his own power and male privilege, the book appropriates both the Devadasi's subaltern heritage and her material as convenient tools to validate his interpretation of them. My guru often tells me how she agreed to only teach Kannada Karavanga, as she would say in Tamil, Devesh's, because they came from Canada and America, Devesh's dancer friends some Sadir repertoire. The grip she wished to have over the interaction between Kannada Karavanga and herself as the guru with agency was debilitated when, without informing her, she was observed by the ethnographer. Even today, years after the book has been released and received with numerous academic awards in Western world, Muthukannamalama has no access to this work, which is in the English language.
கோயிலை பத்தி கூட அந்த ஆளு கேட்கலாங்க. சதுரை பத்தி கேட்டாங்க, தஞ்சாவூரை பத்தி கேட்டாங்க, நீங்க ஆகணும்னா சொல்லி கொடுத்த இதை தெரிஞ்சுன மாதிரி கோயிலை பத்தி நம்ம வரலாறு பத்தி கேட்டுக்கிறோம். சத்தியமா சொல்றேங்க, கன்னடாக்காரவன் நான் புக்கு போடுறேன்னா சொல்லியே கொடுத்துருக்க மாட்டேன். நான் உங்கள்கிட்ட கற்றுக்கத்தாம வந்திருக்கேன், கற்றுக்கிறேன். நான் எங்கே போனாலும் நான் ஆடுறேன் சதுரன்னு சொல்லி சொன்னாங்க. அதனால நான் கற்று கொடுத்தேன். இப்போ அவங்க என்ன பண்ணுறாங்க எப்படின்னு எனக்கு தெரியாது.
Muthukannamalama is 80 plus years old today and boldly articulates in Tamil her identity. Devadasi, daughter of Ramachandra Natavanar, not a courtesan, not merely an essay-velalar. She wants to exercise her narrative only through her material, Sadir, dancing and singing. As a guru, she holds the position of power in a relationship and decides to transfer Sadir in the traditional methods to her students, who she believes can at least sensitively receive it. In conclusion, without fluent capacity in material and native language, attempting to understand the subaltern's heritage is an exercise that superimposes theoretical frames on the assumed unfinished subject. In a world where social media frenzied consumptions swiftly circulates these theories in a factoidal manner, enmeshing them with public domain understandings of freedom, equality, rights, etc., the problem of appropriation in the case of the Devadasi conflict is as present as historic. The trend of making her visible but muting her voice, or making her visible by ventriloquizing, or to point to models of historic appropriation in a language that does not acknowledge its own hegemony of representation is fundamentally a colonial setup. I am neither suggesting complacency of remaining in current positions, nor the totalizing of history towards some universal notion of chance and encounter as solutions. I'm also not suggesting the Guru Sishya model, nor dancing, singing, and native language as material that is flawless and as alternative tools to represent the Devadasi and her heritage. I'm also not saying that all those who get fluent capacity in her material necessarily hold the key to knowing her better. There is no one history. There are several histories, and each history is contingent upon many encounters. To recognize this in the Devadasi conflict is to realize her life as the meaning to the material that is her art. I use the word realize because in realization, the frenzied need for both interpretation and representation somewhat dissolve. The process of decolonizing dance history is not to merely point fingers at the gaps that have grown to become the norm in post-colonial research on the subject. The growing schisms between practitioners and theoreticians, scholars from the West and Indian scholars, media and political fringe groups, art interlocutors and artists is deeply problematic because it disallows non-polarized engagement. The decolonizing of dance history is not a prescription to do away with dance history, but to change the way we do it. We must refuse to discuss matters anymore in the older simplified terms. The work of decolonizing dance history is to now recognize that writings have gone uninterrogated and unproblematized, ignoring many important constitutive aspects. The colonial power structures have produced certain specific ways of framing social discriminations, such as caste, race, etc., which are the basis upon which we are still operating all other social relations of class, patronage, collaborations, everything else. Therefore, we must allow for scholarship to emerge in a way that can formulate theories, evolve terminologies, frameworks, and theses that allow for the ensemble of intrinsic social relations that the history of dance, particularly that which concerns the Devadasi. This alone might have the ability to pathway into becoming purposeful plans and policies, including shifting social norms and perceptions that affect directly the life, dignity, livelihood, and heritage of the Devadasi in a form of rehabilitation and reparation. For now, I conclude by saying, we free her from our theoretical representations so that she may redefine herself. That is the problem of appropriation, the reason why we should not write a book on the Devadasi. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Swarna. It was a fascinating talk. I now invite Dr. Akhila Ramnarayan into the discussion to take forward the question answers.
Thank you very much, Sajna. I'm sorry, I have some connectivity problems, so that's why I have my video off. Thank you, Swarna, for being the first arts faculty member to speak in the divisional talks. We had one by Ananya Dasgupta from literature last week, or the week before, last week, I think. Anyway, and thank you so much, Sajna. I said this last time before everybody left, after everybody had left, but Sajna has curated these talks and she's taking care of the flow of conversation from the division, and I'm eternally grateful to her for that. Thank you. So now we invite questions. You can place your questions in the chat, or you can just raise your hand or just say you would like to speak. It's informal here. Anybody who has a question or would like to make an observation or respond to the talk, please go ahead.
Sorry.
Yes, please, Suraj, go ahead.
If I may. Yeah, namaskaram to everybody. Thank you, Dr. SWARNAMALYA, for that talk. As I've understood from your talk, you've laid out the problems with a sort of ethnographic study where there's a distancing from what they're trying to study. You know, they don't have first-hand or personal interactions with the community. You mentioned one of the ways in which that gaze is problematic, in that they have problematized the word Devadasi. Are there any, I personally haven't read Mr. Soneji's book. Are there other arguments that he poses in his book to which you have personal objections in how he sees this issue? I mean, based from what I've understood, you're saying, okay, this way, the method of doing it is problematic. I see that. But are there specific ways that he problematizes the whole issue of the Devadasi to which you object? You've mentioned one thing, the usage of the name. Are there other things that he talks about?
Should I take a few questions, or should I go one by one? Maybe I'll take a
You
couple.
go ahead and respond to, or I think Sumitra had something to say. Anybody who wants to respond can, or you can go ahead and respond to this question. I don't see anything else in the chat yet.
Okay, so let me answer that question. Thank you, Suraj, for yes. I mean, see, I think I mean the idea was not to, of course, pick the unfinished gestures alone as I mean, it was merely an example, also because it was closer to home. It was my own guru's life. See, I think I've mentioned more than one problem that I see. I think maybe I didn't articulate it as clearly as I was speaking. One is, of course, the problem of the term Devadasi, as you rightly pointed out. But the other is also, for example, the meshing together of several lives, the homogenizing. I think that has become the larger problem that we have today, right? The term Devadasi itself is problematic in another sense, because that is not the term by which they were all known. For example, the longest time in Tamil Nadu, in the inscriptions as well as in the everyday existence of their lives, my guru, for example, was known as Molakara or Melakara families, right? So Melakars. And then there were other families that were called as Mudalis. And then there were other families that would be called as Manikams. And each of them came from different positions and different identities. So the umbrella term Devadasi itself is a problem, but even that, which has been, largely, now accepted by several of them in the community, also because it has lived through several hundred years. When we make a rough translation of that as courtesan, then that becomes problematic, because courtesan is a very different idea, notion altogether. The second thing is to homogenize many of their experiences. That's what I said. I think to think of ideas of our ideas of what we believe in as freedom and rights, and I think one of the things that I see directly problematic in that particular book, in one of the narrations, is, for example, the framing of her repertoire. There is a repertoire that she does in the temple as part of her temple repertoire, the Modi, right? It's the Modi Mastan dance that she does. That has been dislocated from the way it is done even today. I mean, see, the good thing about Muthakanamal, and I chose her specifically as an example, is because she's with us today, right? And therefore she can speak for herself, right? And she is speaking for herself. She's articulating herself. And if you ask her, she says, this dance was done in the temple. This was done as part of the temple rituals, right? So, and it had a secular, well, I won't use the word secular, it had a social tone to it, because it's called Kottagai Sadir. But it was nevertheless part of her religious sanction. So to extricate it from there and to argue a case that Isaivalar dance was fully free of religious sanction, and therefore Bharatanatyam recapsulates it within the religious frame. Bharatanatyam has done a lot of problematic things, right? This is not one of it. I mean, this is partially only Bharatanatyam's doing. I mean, much of it also comes from them, which is why she keeps reiterating that she is Devadasi, and therefore she was in fact, in another recording, she would say her father, Ramachandra Nattavanar, refused to come to Chennai when Varu Ramaya Pillai was taken off, because he refused. Varu Ramaya Pillai came. The reason why Ramachandra Nattavanar refused to come was because he was dedicated to his temple service. Varu Ramaya Pillai was not part of a temple service in Varuvur. So these distinctions are very important for us to understand. I think we are at a stage where I think these are important for us to now be more nuanced about how we write, if we want.
Swarna, this is Sumitra.
Hi.
Yeah, hi. Just, 2 or 3 things that struck me. One is, this kind of almost of a binary that you're sort of positioning between an insider study of the Guru Shishya Parampara being, a transfer of knowledge within a particular kind of a power dynamic versus the ethnographer, where you're saying that they typically, do not come and study with the guru, and there is a different kind of a power relationship. It's, within the disciplines of ethnomusicology, dance studies, performance studies, this kind of debate has been going on for a long time. And as you will know, people like Stephen Feld in 1984, he spoke about dialogic editing, right? Yeah. Where working in Papua New Guinea, he actually took his work back and so I'm asking, is given that the ethics of doing ethnography and that many ethnomusicologists have spent decades sometimes learning with teachers, what do you say about that? Leave alone people who, study first for 20 years and then become ethnomusicologists or ethnographers, or in your own case, you became a dance scholar. That's one aspect of the question. Is this more of while I acknowledge the power dynamics, can you speak a little bit to how the fields themselves have been reflecting on this issue without taking away from the issue at all? That's one thing. The second thing is the issue of categories. I was reminded of Amy Mazursky's writing on North Indian musicians, where she learned for many years from Girija Devi. So a student of Girija Devi, but also a scholar. She identifies that there are at least 4 different ways of coping with categories, with how hereditary performers have dealt with the issue of categories. And one of the ways is to actually reject the category. The other way is to embrace it. The other way is to embrace it and then redefine the practice. And I've forgotten the 4th. We're actually reading this piece on Friday in my arts class. But so I forgot the 4th. So I just wanted you to comment a little bit on whether you've seen other responses from, I know you've worked with a number of hereditary performers. So are there people who don't, who have different points of view?
Absolutely. I'll go with the second. I'll start with the second question, if you don't mind. So, yeah. No, I think you're absolutely right. That's the whole point, that I was making, that there is no one way of responding to all of this. Like, for example, in the current, as we speak, there are certain members of the hereditary lineage who have become vocal about their identity and who want to take a certain political stance, and and they're rightful in doing whatever they're doing, right? So as you rightly said, they're embracing certain categories, right? And there are, of course, people like Muthu Kannamal who's saying, she frames herself in fact, she says, look, I reject all the terminologies. If you ask me, I'll say, yes, I'm Devadasi. If you ask me, I'll say, yes, in my ration card, it says Isaivalal, so on and so forth. But I would rather simply be known as daughter of Ramachandran Attavanar and Muthu Kannamal. So they're also sort of, when I worked with the National Women's Commission, the survey when we sort of looked through the southern states, I worked, except in Maharashtra, I worked in Karnataka, Andhra, Tamil Nadu, and Kerala. And it was astounding for us in Tamil Nadu how of course, in Karnataka and Andhra, people like Amy Jairus Boy have done some work with the Karnataka, the Joginis and all of them. But in Tamil Nadu, the categories are so varied. In Viralimalai itself, let me come back to Viralimalai, the composition of women there within the Isaivalalar quote unquote caste identity are so varied. Muthukanamal is a Mudaliyar. Then next street are the Sengunda Mudaliyars. Then the next street are, you know, women who have moved from Andhra Pradesh and have resettled there as migrants way back, but, you know, have now. So what is this distinction is the way they see, the way they reject or take on these categories based on also that identity and their own experience of how the entire experience of the act itself in 1947 and 1970 and all of that, right? So within Viralimalai, Muthukanamal is the creme de la creme of the community, because she is the topmost layer of the community. Her father was the guru for most of the women there. So yes, I understand that there are power dynamics within them as well, and therefore it's even more important therefore for us to not push ourselves into these categories and expect to slot all of them into them. That is my biggest problem, you know, slotting them. You know, it almost, you know, every time I see those slots, I feel like Edgar Thurston is going back and doing his tab tables and columns in his castes and tribes, you know. So it feels very, because there have been many times when we were doing this survey, we were unable to put them in. See, for example, there's the Devadasi. Now, Muthukanamal is a whole package because she's a dedicated Devadasi, meaning she was a Pottukatna Devadasi. There are ones who were non-dedicated, like Bala Saraswati in Madras was a non-dedicated Devadasi, but she is often identified as a urban representative of the Devadasi community's voice, because we are pitching her against, say, a Rukmini Devi. So, you know, so in that context. But she will not be, I mean, nobody in the villages would have even heard of Bala Saraswati, that sort of a thing, right? And then within them, there are so many categories. That is the one aspect. So I think the categories become problematic because they try to homogenize in some ways. I understand our need to do that academically, but I think as far as dance history is concerned, you know, I come at a time, you know, in this intervention, you know, conveniently after some 70 years, you know, in the post-colonial studies. So I also am at an advantageous position of being able to read through and see the work that people have done, people like Amrit Srinivas and Saskia and all of them. And therefore, you know, I always tell them, and I'm good friends with all of them, I tell them, you know, I also have the responsibility, therefore, to analyze and see what are the gaps that exist in this field. And as you rightly said, you know, I am first a performer and a learner, and it was only much later that I transformed into you know, a scholar. But even then, I'm very intrigued by why, despite having that close association with some of them, I've not found the voice to write a book on them. I've been asked very often that, and I've asked myself why, and I've also asked some of my other friends who have learned with, you know, the Devadasis, as to why they have not written, you know, about her as much as, you know, people would have liked to hear, even though there are what we call as documentations, hours of recordings of class hours and etc. You know, we've not found the need. I mean, these are recordings that you saw now that were deliberately done to document her life. But there are class recordings that are far more informal, where she's speaking, you know, entirely in her own sort of atmosphere and, you know, all of that. So I've asked myself that question. And I think insofar as the field itself investigating the gaps in a pure ethnographic situation, I think people have done that. As you rightly say, you know, there have been so many scholars who have gone back and reflected on the ethics of ethnography and the efficacy of an ethnographer's presence, especially if it is not something that, you know, as you rightly said, take back to the community. Right? But what is this take back, and what are the power dynamics that are involved in this taking back? These are questions, particularly in the dance field, I think now is pressing. Also, I'll tell you why, because it has captured, as always, the imagination of the public. The Devadasi has captured yet again, I feel like this is a renaissance of the romanticizing. So today we are at a space where social media feeds are filled with, you know, like factoidal, like I said, factoidal, you know, sort of articles and photographs and all of that about the Devadasi. We are hearing so many voices. It's amazing. It's wonderful in one sense. But how does one make sense? I mean, if one wants to engage, then they realize that they are constantly at loggerheads with highly polarized narratives. And, I have myself, despite being a student of some of these women and, having a certain, I can claim to have a certain sense of empathy. I have been subject myself to several highly polarized debates where we've been cornered. So I keep thinking, I mean, if there is no space for engagement, then it's time to stop and reflect on the processes that have led us here. So that's why I think perhaps ethnographic studies as a field has begun this sort of inward look at its ethical, resources and all of that a little ahead. But the dance field of ethnographic study, I think, has not come there yet. And therefore, my argument is to bring that discourse to this space, because it's the need of the hour.
Swarna, we have three very interesting questions. Let's go to a student question now. The other two are from Ananya and Apritha. Or Keetana Patsati. I'm assuming this is a student because I don't recognize them as a faculty member, but you've also invited some people, so I don't want to misspeak. But they do address you as professor. Professor, what do you think of the word? Pardon my explicit use of this word, Devadiya, and its use in relation to the Devadasi. Was this a term that initially held respect and then came to be something demeaning, or did it begin as a slur? What do the Devadasis of this age think of this term? And I think Krishna has done some work, TM, on reclaiming the word Porambokku. So this is interesting as a sort of a parallel to that. Go ahead, Swarna.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for that question. Actually, a few years ago, there was a huge controversy in the city of Chennai because there was this poet, with questionable repute, Vairamuthu, but nonetheless, he had made a remark in the public domain about Andal, the Vaishnavite goddess poetess, who, he compared her to a Devadasi, and hell broke loose in Tamil Nadu and of course all around the country and the world, where people condemned the right-wing group, especially condemned Vairamuthu for comparing Andal to a Devadasi. Right. And I wrote, and a few others, I think we all took objection to the idea, not because Andal was compared to a Devadasi, but because they thought Devadasi is so derogatory that one can't be compared to her. Right. So I found the irony so hard to digest. And I had written a series of articles in the papers. And one of the points I make is, you see, if we want to look at social reformation, and if we want to look at reparations, and if we want to look at all that, the first thing is to start shifting our social norms. I mean, if you go to an auto stand even today, and or if you're traveling on the road and somebody comes to comes really close to your car, you will invariably hear, why auto? I mean, all of us, there are so many amidst us who will immediately use the te word, as we call it in Tamil, right? So Tevadiya has become a slur, and it has continued to live on with that connotation. But Devadiya actually is Tevar Adiyal, which is two words. Devar is Deva, Adiyal is a Tamil word for Devadasi. So Devar Adiyal. So Devar Adiyal has become Devadiyal over the years, and it has remained in the and it's not a post 1940s connotation. This has remained as Devadiyal, as in with that. So that's the thing, right? If you look at 16th 17th centuries, even literature like the Tiruvulas and Tamil literatures and even Telugu literatures in the Tamil country, you see that slowly people are beginning to they are using the Devadasi's voice to slur her. So, the Ula is a fantastic example literature where the Devadasi would perform the Ula. I'll give you one example from my own guru's repertoire. See, she says, Yenna seiguven penne, yen mohatte. In that she says, Vesik kasillamal vera piriyamundo. That's how she, Vesik kasillamal vera piriyamundo. It's sung in beautiful Sahana, no doubt, by the Devadasi, in her presence, in her embodied, self. But she's singing about, the promiscuity of her own identity, right? So these have remained. And, if we, like I said, if we want to, I can't draw the, once golden, now rotten, sort of binary, therefore. It has been through time, the unfortunateness of patriarchy is such that it's allowed the pain and the boon to
Aside, steps இருக்கு நான்
Yeah, that's the
gate கிட்ட வச்சிட்டு
there's a lot more one can
மாடிக்கு வரணும் first floor.
Ananya, I'll take your question.
Sideல இருக்கு அந்த building ஓட sideல மாடில.
There are other young contemporary artists who find Soneji's book enabling. What are your
அங்க வெளியில gate கிட்ட
what are they finding enabling in his work? See, I think the reason why I took exception to that particular book is because, as I replied to Suraj, because it enmeshes several Devadasi accounts under one umbrella of a non-hereditary male person's understanding, number one. And also because I happen to know, some of them personally, I see that there's a huge stark difference between that reality and them. So anybody who has not had that experience with these women or a closer, see, that's another thing, going back to Sumitra's question, right? So the multiplicity of identities. So a Devadasi woman today, somebody who claims to come from a Devadasi community, as I said, the Devadasi is not, you can't be born as a Devadasi. You will have to be dedicated, or you will have to be, put into the service of the temple as a Devadasi. And then there were the non-dedicated Devadasis who it became an umbrella term for them. So most of the girls or women who come from the lineage today are people who come from the lineage. There are several of them. There are several young, older people, men, women, right? And so they all, see, the thing is, if they feel a resonance to the kind of ideology, the kind of revolution that the book talks about, the kind of political stance that the book takes about, caste and all of that, I mean, that's good for them. I mean, if that's how they feel. But all I say is, from the historical perspective, it's important that we don't homogenize the community and use their personal narratives to create a universal theory. That has become more harmful than it has been useful, right? So I think if they feel enabled, if they feel like that book is giving them the voice that they need, good for them. I mean, there's no two ways about that. But I do think that, especially in the case of Muthukannamal, because she's very much alive, and she feels that her agency is compromised when things are being written about her in a different language that's alien to her. I think it's important, as writers of the subaltern heritage, and as people who are looking at politicizing their position in the world of, current world of politics, it's important that we recognize and respect her view. That's my view about that particular book and people.
Thank you, Swarna, and my apologies. One of those Zoom mistakes for this update call right in.
Sorry,
No. Anyway, Swarna, I think there is another question. Preetha Chakrabarti is asking. It's a very long question, but I think the main point of it is about why can't I write about? How can we identify the ideological prerogative which makes her, the Devadasi, celebrate her commitment to the temple? So she's sort of asking how to navigate, I think, the space between being a practitioner and being a scholar, and finding the critical space. So that's the second part of it. As a trained Bharatanatyam dancer who has studied in the power-based structure of the Guru Shishya Parampara for decades, I can't help but wonder how to maintain academic criticality while operating within the Guru Shishya structures. And I think we can pair this with Ananya's question, where she says other younger contemporary.
Yeah, I just answered Ananya's question, Akhila.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I know. Okay. But we can pair, what I mean is we can pair it. I mean, it flows from this question.
Correct. No, I mean, like I said, Preetha, thank you for that question. I'll also read through the entire, comment a little later. I think it's, so the idea is not to say that, I mean, that's why I said, there is no one straightjacketed answer to that, right? I mean, clearly, I don't hold the answer to that at this point, definitely. I think what we need at this point is to first put the pause button and reflect and interrogate our methods of writing, our how do we really step out of this comfort zone that we have built around us, which is a voice of revolution, right? I mean, the voice of revolution is wonderful. I mean, I will resonate with it at many other levels, but as someone who's also seen the inside, it's not as uncomplicated. I feel like this voice of revolution in the binary has oversimplified the situation, and that has only led to today, just two narratives existing. Either you are for romanticizing of the Devadasi or you're not, right? So I don't have a ready-made answer to this, except I think the decolonizing requires for us to sit and deliberate and be willing to take criticism and take a step back and reanalyze, finding, I think, as Sumitra said, some lessons in people who have done this, ethical ethnographic search ahead of us, and to take some lessons from there, and also to listen to the voices that are there. Very few, but all of them, whether they are from the urban or people like Muthu Kannamal and several others who don't speak in the English language, right? I think that's the key to me. And, I think only two things I can see is the language and their material, which is their art, which is very far and few. So you need interlocutors in between. You can't, the art cannot be transferred or transmitted or even understood without translation. So there you have a loss too. So it's a bit of a problem, but it's something that we have to sit and talk.
Thanks, Swarna. And perhaps we can, somebody's asking about Pritika Venkatraman about the reclamation of Sadir as Bharatanatyam. What is your take on that? And of course, I've heard you speak about this in several contexts. So but I think we have an evolving relationship with this question. So I think, at different points in time as scholars. So perhaps you could speak to how you feel now.
I think Vishnu has a few comments to make. He's just...
Yeah. Do you want to take this question, or do you want?
Yeah, Pritika. Pritika's in my class, so I'll take the liberty of saying this. Pritika, it's a big, vast question. The reclamation, the term reclamation itself is quite questionable. Okay, reclamation, renaissance, resurrection. These are all terminologies that need to come under this kind of. So it's, I know we've been using especially your generation. You must have heard these terms so frequently used and thrown around in your understanding of dance history. Therefore, it's very important for us to pause now and really ask what happened, right? If it is 1947, if it's 1857, what happened then? What changed? And then what happened in 1947? What happened in 1971? Actually, as it happens, October 29th, 1947, just tomorrow, is when the Devadasi, the Dedication Act was passed. The bill was made into a law in 1947. So this is the right time, I think, for us to pause and ask these questions. So I'll be happy to take your question and answer you more in detail, perhaps in our class, Pritika, if that's okay, because it's a very long question and I've written about it too.
Yes, Professor, thank you.
Vishnu, if you would like to say.
Yeah, let me, Sona, thank you very much. Thank you, Akhila. I just want to make 2 points. Both are methodological points. One, there's a third among the multiple alternatives that you presented. There is yet another alternative of depicting that narrative and story, which I thought people like Frederick Margolin did while studying Devadasis in Puri, because Wives of God King. This came out in 1990s. And that narrative was actually structured around a larger story of auspiciousness and inauspiciousness, if I remember correctly. I read it a long time ago. So this is, lives and narratives are then structured around the ideas generated out of Devadasis. Devadasis spoke a lot about, that's why the Nitya Sumangali, there's other books and so on and so forth. So there is one kind of narrative which takes up something from the Devadasis, but put them in a completely different pedestal, put them as a larger thing within which their stories can be told. This is one. Second is a slightly, maybe politically a little incorrect, because I think, the idea of agency, often we think, which is actually a very modern thing to think of agency as if agency actually resides in one individual alone. In fact, this is something we may like to interrogate a bit. Sometimes agency actually is produced through a lot of interactive dialogical ways. You know, for example, I may be saying certain things. You may say, I'm actually exercising agency, but that's not agency. I'm actually too much shaped, overdetermined by many things outside. So it is not really, so agency and what you produce, even ethnographic materials. I had an interesting experience that I'll say and stop. I had a very interesting conversation with Pierre Bourdieu years ago, just a few years before he died, in Collège de France, when he just published his book, which again got translated into English, called The Suffering in the World, but in French is called La Misère du Monde, which is about the suffering of people in hospitals and stuff like that, and so on. And he and his colleague did a phenomenal work on idea of suffering. And I myself at that time was writing on indignities. So I had this opportunity to talk to him as to what is this idea of agency and how do you really talk? How do you really produce something? So he said a very interesting thing, which actually what really I'm saying, which is basically saying that every time a conversation is agency or are things that we do through conversation. He said there is, sometimes he goes to somebody who is lying ill on hospital bed. And while the person is talking about it, and Bourdieu tells me that he tells this guy, give him a metaphor. So the guy on the bed says, hey, yes, we, professor, we. You know, they're saying that, look, yes, you got it. You know, to say that Bourdieu gave a metaphor, and therefore it is not within the agency of the guy who is describing may not be correct. So what I'm trying to say, that the idea of agency is something sometimes we take for granted. We think that this is what agency is all about. But agency itself is, certain ideas of agency actually too narrow. Certain ideas of agency is actually too historically shaped. And so instead of really taking agency as counter to some kind of determination or lack of autonomy, one can really think of agency in quite different ways. I don't know if I'm making sense. They may not. So that really turns around our research and everything in a completely different way. I thought I would make these comments, but thank you very much for presenting this, because this is a very hugely debatable, controversial thing. And people are still debating as to not only Tamil Nadu, but in everywhere, you know, it's about whether that's correct or not. That's not, you know, whether the 20s narrative, 1920s narrative of reform, how much they elided, how much they obscured, how much they articulating things which are, so I think that debate is still on, but I thought that the agency is not going to give us a route, escape, or a stable frame unless we really understand agency as itself is a problematic category.
Absolutely. I think, I mean, if anything, thank you so much, Vishnu, for that, because if anything, I think the narratives today have already, and also I must add here that the current political, social scenario of the Me Too movement has really brought the agency in the Guru-Sishya relationship to the fore, questionably, its efficiency, all of it. So in this milieu, it's very important to understand the limitations of the agency, particularly in this Guru-Sishya relationship. In fact, that's one of the reasons why I foregrounded that it's definitely not the alternative or the answer to any of this, but it is one way of at least understanding that there is a gap. And that's what I presented today. This is not to a conclusive frame, alternative frame as such. I think that frame has to evolve over time, something that I'll work on, and hopefully others will join and invest in trying to figure out, because I think it's the time to do so. Thank you.
Thank you, Swarna. I think this talk has been so successful in sparking a lot of food for thought, a lot of debate among all of us. And I think there's an opportunity here for us as a division to engage the relationship between literature and the arts in precisely such contexts where, you know, there is a robust critique of what we call bourgeois nationalism in the Tamil public sphere as well. And we have a lot of great scholars who have, of our times, who are writing about these subjects from different vantage points, such as V. Geeta or Aro Venkatachalapati. And I think it's important for us to perhaps think about dance having conversation with other genres too, that have been part of what we call Marumalarchi, right? The English word Renaissance is inadequate. But that's the Tamil Marumalarchi as a way of trying to revive an interest in the arts and the kinds of, appropriation that occurred, along the way, because the arts had to serve this sort of cultural agenda of bourgeois nationalism. So I think there is a larger conversation to be had, and perhaps our division and in conversation with other divisions at CRIA can facilitate these conversations, because I think there's a tendency for dance to have this conversation in a silo sometimes, and for literature to have a conversation in a silo. So I think the more we broaden the conversation, I think we'll be doing our work as scholars at CRIA. So thank you so much for initiating this conversation, and let us continue it in sessions to come and events to come. Thank you so much, Swarna. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you all for attending and being part of this very lively conversation.
Thank you, Professor.
Oh, and all of you, please join Professor Swaminathan's lecture.
Yes, Professor Swaminathan's interwoven lecture for students is at 5 o'clock. Please join that as well. If you're in the first year, I think you're required to come for creative expressions. So please be there to hear about the wonders of Mamallapuram.
Yes.
And the Pallavas.
Thank you, Akhila, and thank you, Shrajana, for really curating this so beautifully.
Oh, it was very nice.
Thank you.
We'll discuss it.
Yeah, we should. Okay, so Professor Swaminathan has been calling me relentlessly. Let me call him back.
Okay.
I am not answering his calls. Gosh.
Go ahead.